Greetings and salutations, everybody. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Snarp Fangle Podcast, episode 39. I am your host, Jake Metzger, along with my co-host. Need a witness just to know he's there. From the tips of his fingers, every strand of his beard hair. You know someone's watching him, watching me, watching him, and all that he look upon a seam. And you may not know him, but you feel his stare. David Reed. Here you are, David.
What an introduction.
Yes. Well, it's good to be here with you today. How is David Reed today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good. Riding high in this post-Trump world that we live in.
Oh, God. I was worried if you
Not to get political or
not
anything.
to get political or anything. Oh, but yeah, I thought that was interesting. I was worried you were going to bring it up, you know. Yeah, it's like, you know, there's so many avenues we can go, but I'm just going to move on from here. So anyway, so if you have any thoughts or concerns or hate mail about the election, please direct them to snarpfanglepod@gmail.com. Also, send your ideas of where they filmed the Sisyphus music video by Andrew Bird, because I'm curious to see where they did it. In fact, it looks like when you watch it, it seems like there's a wildfire in the background, in the far background in one of the shots. And I was worried about that when watching the Sisyphus. I need to pronounce that right, not the other way I pronounced the Sisyphus, you know?
Not the other way.
Not the other way, yeah. But yeah, direct them all at snarpfanglepod@gmail.com. We are very glad and honored to have you listening to us. So David, let's get us started with you. What did you, you've brought something to the congregation of the YouTubes and the internets out there for the Snarp Fangles that are listening. But what do you want to talk about today?
So today I want to talk about the intersection between worldview and creativity. I've been a creative person for many years now, or at least I've tried to be. I've been interested in the creative arts for many, many years now, and I've just started to notice some things. I guess we'll just get right into it.
Yeah.
So
it's going to be a juicy one, I feel.
Well, we'll
Something
see.
to sink your teeth into.
One can only hope.
Yes.
So, yeah. So basically, I kind of want to start by sort of just laying out the thing that I've noticed as I've been a student of various worldviews over the years, as I've delved deeper into creative arts and various forms of media. I've noticed a pattern, so to speak. So in our modern world, it seems like there's this like sort of it seems like we have
I see you. You're reaching for it.
I'm reaching for it.
You can get it. I believe in you.
It was right there.
It was right there.
And then, like the bird on Napoleon Dynamite, it simply flew away.
Flapping its wings.
Okay. All right. So,
I kind of want to go on a tangent of what song they were listening to, because I don't remember. In the classroom in that scene in Napoleon Dynamite. Do you remember what song they were listening to when they were doing the hand motions?
Oh God, no.
I don't remember.
It was one of those. It was one of those like old hippie naturey songs. There's something about like streams and rivers and.
I feel like we're gonna have to watch that soon for the two films, but it'll have to fall into. I don't know what category it will, but it will fall into somewhere.
Yes.
Two films about social outcasts. But anyway, let's revert back to what was on the front of you and you were reaching for.
Yeah, so I guess we'll go a little further back in history. So what you have starting, as far as I can tell, in the late 1800s is a shift in society from a sort of Judeo-Christian sort of value system to a secularized, to a more secular value system. And like the process of secularization of society itself, I think is a really complicated topic, so I'm not really going to delve into it. But suffice to say, it kind of starts in the late 1800s, and then when you enter into the post-war period, you have like postmodern ideologies on the rise. You have the rise of the
you have like McCarthyism after the post-war stuff.
You have like the rise of the sort of secular intelligentsia of Western society, so to speak. Because if we go back in time, society was driven very, very much by the church. And so sort of the thought leaders of the day were your monks, your priests, your popes, and such. And you can see it in all sorts of things. Like you had, since we're going to be talking about the creative arts, you have the composer Vivaldi, known for his Four Seasons. And you have, I bring him up because he's kind of an example of the opposite of the trend I see today. So in the time that he lived, he went into the priesthood because being in the priesthood was like a career choice back then. I mean, it is in certain places, but it's not like,
it's not like, hey, mom, I'm going to grow up to be a priest.
Yeah.
But back then that was a thing.
Like you can make money being the leader of a church now, but it's more like a side benefit. Whereas back in the day, like going into the priesthood meant getting an education, meant finding a finding a job, essentially. Like it was very tied to making a living. And so Vivaldi does this. He goes into the priesthood, and he creates many sacred works as well as secular works. And he does this simply, as far as we can tell today, he does this simply out of just pure economics. He wasn't a very religious man in sense of his like personal devotion to Jesus or anything like that. It was like the gig of being a member of the clergy was simply just a paying job for him. It's how he got his education and how he got the contacts necessary to be able to make a living producing his music. So, and then by the late 1800s, this trend started to reverse, and you had this sort of the intelligentsia, the thought leaders, the people that were looked up to, had themselves become entirely divorced from the church and from religious or spiritual beliefs entirely in certain cases. And so this sort of happens around the same. So going back to the post-war period, you have all of this coming to a head around the same time as the Hollywood movie industry is established, and as well as the recording industry.
Technology and the kind of pinnacle of that era.
So because the media we now consume in the modern age has its roots in the beginnings of recording technology, in the beginning of Hollywood movies and the like. Because, before movies and recorded music. You know, you read books, you went and saw someone play music, you went to the theater, and then technology came along and changed all of that to the point where reading books without the aid of technology or going to see a musician play a song in person or going to the theater is now something done specifically for the sake of doing that specific thing. You know, now we read on our phones, or we read on tablets, or we read on our computers, we listen to pre-recorded music, we watch movies, and that's sort of the normal way we consume media.
Okay.
You know, the non-technological forms of consuming media are things that people do for the sake of consuming media in a non-technological way, if you catch my drift.
Yeah.
And so that has its roots, like music publishers that are around today got their start in this area. Hollywood got its start in this era. And so
So there's a history built up from that point on, basically.
Yes.
And whoever ran that or controlled or created or was the head of that, that's the history we have.
Indeed.
Okay.
And so what's that sort of happened is that within the established sort of creatives, you know, you have seemingly this sort of secularized, left-leaning liberal philosophy sort of embedded in the established sort of creative work that much of our media draws inspiration from. So I just thought that was...
It sounds like a realization you've had.
Yeah, so it's just something that I slowly noticed it more and more over the years. And so I just kind of want to explore the topic, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't want to get too deep into like things like history and stuff where I'm, I'm not totally educated on a lot of the, finer details of that, but more like, you can see the once you see it, you can't unsee it kind of a thing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of interesting because for me, like, I love history, but it's not like, I don't know everything, obviously, but I think it does fascinate the curious mind to a certain extent there, because you're bringing up like the post-war era. You're bringing up before that where it was the talkies after the silent film era. You have the Roaring 20s where you had the crazy, like insane America, the Western world, where the Western world was at in the 20s was insane and crazy, like in debauchery of bounds and all that kind of stuff. And then you have the 30s, the Great Depression. You have these kind of patterns throughout history. And it's weird because it seems like today we're so focused on what we consume and what are our places in the culture where it's all online, versus back in the day you had none of those worries. And even before that, you only had to worry about the church and eat and figuring out how to get your next meal and that kind of thing. And same thing for the 20s in a certain extent. But the point I'm trying to make is it's interesting to think about in that time, there was no vast amount of technology to worry about, I guess. And it's such a huge contrast from today that makes you wonder what everybody was worrying about and what had on their mind. But also, to take it back around to where you were talking about in the 50s or in the 40s, I would say, where media and movies and the Hollywood industry on the rise, I think of stuff like Frank Capra in the 30s and 40s and then 50s. It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Those films they've stood the test of time, and it's interesting to think about that positive force in America. And I don't think you have that positive force without the moral foundations. And I think with the moral foundations, that takes you back to the church.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is what's interesting is you don't see extreme moral decay until more recent years. I would say in the probably in the 80s, the 90s, is when you really started seeing the effects of that sort of moral foundation sort of crumbling away. But what's interesting is in the period before that, when secularization was rampant, and yet there's still a certain moral character to a lot of the works, to a lot of the media produced from that era, because I feel like Western society in general is like the values that made the West what it is today are very much based in the Judeo-Christian realm, and I would say are a direct consequence of the total Christianization of Europe starting in the Middle Ages.
And then the Crusades after that, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so you have all that history of culture being totally bound to biblical morality, and basically, in my opinion, that's what made the West what it was.
Yeah, it's what made it great. What made the best in the West, you know?
Yeah.
At least that's what I would argue. I mean, I was looking at Thomas Sowell before we started recording this, and I was looking at that because I was listening to some of his interviews, and he's a wealth of wisdom if you're interested about culture and specifically black culture and stuff like that. But he has an interesting viewpoint of, it was in a speech he made, I believe in the 70s, where, and he's a famous economist, but he said something to the extent of, in the speech I was watching, the Irish didn't bring their culture over to America and then try to keep it like exactly the way it was, because it was different. They were adapting. There was the melting pot, etc. And because they lost some of this culture back in Ireland, which you can still go back to, it kind of made them, I don't know the exact words he used, but later on they were one of the staples of culture in America, the Irish and so on and so forth. Not just because of the culture they brought, but because of how they were able to adapt to America and kind of adapt to Western ideals. And I think the reason why the West here, the Western civilization, has been the best, in my opinion, is because of those Judeo-Christian values, like you're saying. And I look at stuff like Japan, which is further west than us over here in the U.S., but I guess it's considered to be in the East, you know? But I look at that kind of culture and I see like the insane decline of their birth rate. A lot of the young folks over there have a huge disrespect for their elders. Just generally speaking, we have that same issue in America, but to different extents. I'm not saying that's a special case in Japan, but I think it's interesting to see that culture kind of try to hold on and to keep being prosperous. But how does a culture, a nation be prosperous? I feel like it's kind of under the blessing of God and his people wherever they go. And I feel like with the crumbling of the moral foundations in the 80s, 90s, etc., you look back at the 70s, man, where it felt like, you know, Vietnam and all this stuff. And in the 60s as well. I mean, with the love movement and love revolution and all that kind of stuff, I'm definitely not the right person to talk about that kind of thing, who's well educated in that. But what I will say is, you see the kind of moral decay from the kids who were born in the 50s and before, to then being adults in the 70s and 80s and 70s and 80s, and the kind of media they created. They came up with pretty good stuff in this country, and then it's kind of the saying of, weak men create hard times, and hard times create strong men, and strong men create good times, which creates weak men. So,
yeah.
I don't know. What do you think about all that?
Yeah. Well, there was definitely a shift in the morality of creative people in that era. I don't think it necessarily creatives became worse. It's just that creative works were no longer had become completely divorced from an idea that you had to the idea that you had to adhere to any kind of a biblical morality or have like a traditional sort of family focused sort of political viewpoint, you know?
Well, it's like, what is it? God, family, and country in that order. I feel like a lot of media that's created doesn't have God, doesn't have family, and definitely doesn't have country. And it's not saying it necessarily has to, but when you don't have those foundations in your life, specifically with God, most importantly, you kind of create media that it's not part of your life.
Yeah.
The stuff that's in your life that is absence of God.
Yeah. And so what I would say is that I think
specifically with secularism and Judeo-Christian.
Yeah.
And the effects on society.
Yeah, it has effects on society, but also what I want to look at is specifically creativity and and how it goes along with worldview.
Okay.
So, something I want to move to then is, so society is becoming more and more secular, as we've said, and starting in probably again the 80s and the 90s, you had the church's response to this shift in society was to sort of circle the wagons. And you know, I'm not gonna necessarily speak to stuff that happened in Europe, but in America here, there's always been a strong evangelical streak to the population of this country. And so, and you know, not that evangelicals are the only Christians in America, but they're by far the most visible and the loudest of all believers in this country. Yeah. And so what you saw starting in the 80s and the 90s is the evangelical sort of response to this secular shift was to sort of circle the wagons. We're going to separate ourselves from the culture. We're going to, it's almost like that hunker down and wait for the rapture kind of mentality sort of took over.
Yeah. You know, like, Y2K's coming, everybody. The year 2000. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's going to end. Don't worry. There's an end in sight.
But the result of all that is it seemed like Christians in the U.S. at that point stopped wanting to engage with the culture. And so what we saw was a kind of sort of like little enclave of Christian media, music, movies, books, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. And they were just kind of like, they became sort of segregated from the stuff that the general population was consuming. And yeah, you had stuff like the VeggieTales cartoon series, the Left Behind movie series, the popular books like Why I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
Oh God, that book.
Yeah, I'm not commenting
no,
on
I'm just saying you're listening.
The quality of any of these things. These are just examples.
Yeah, keep going. You're good.
These are just examples. So you have these things that were specifically designed for evangelicals to consume, and they were given a lot of attention by evangelicals and almost no attention by wider audiences, while the things that wider audiences, that the general population was consuming, the evangelicals in the U.S. were actively trying to shield their children from these things. So you had almost like, so you almost had like this sort of invisible boundary line of ideology that separated the two camps of creatives, and the purpose of each camp was markedly different.
Yeah.
So like, secular musicians created music to create music for people to listen to. Secular movie producers, writers, directors, actors produced movies that they thought people wanted to watch, that told stories that they thought would captivate people. And then you had this sort of side industry of creative stuff that was just for the evangelicals who wanted to shield their kids from secular media. And the purpose of this media, it seemed like, was more to provide a quote unquote Christian analog to the secular media, so that, the kids wouldn't feel like they were, like they were being raised in some kind of like cult, They felt like they had, music they could listen to, movies they could watch, books they could read, so they wouldn't be tempted to venture out into the world of secularized media, so to speak. So yeah, it just created a really weird dynamic.
Yeah, dynamic's the right way to say it.
Because I don't know about you, but I was raised in the church, but I wasn't discouraged from consuming secular media.
Yeah.
So for me, there was this weird divide in my life between hearing Christian music on the radio, watching VeggieTales, but then also, growing up watching regular Hollywood movies. It was this weird sort of, it was almost like living in two worlds. I kind of like to hear about your experiences in this matter too.
Ooh, well, I kind of want to go back to, kind of like what I've heard my parents say, because I'm growing up in a family of like 6 on a farm in the church. That's my perspective, and that's where I come from. So just to give that context. So we had not a whole lot to do out in the country, but we kind of cherished the media that we had. And our parents were very careful about, what we watched, that kind of thing. But we were never discouraged from like, you can't watch Star Trek because it's violent or whatever, some stupid reason like that. No, my parents like sat us down and, gave us good culture. Like, here are the Star Trek films and we love them. We're nerds growing up. So here you go, kids. And so we're like, oh, the Star Trek film's cool. And of course, Star Wars and the such. But there's definitely, a good regulation on what we could consume, but there's never a discouragement of, don't watch the latest Batman movie or whatever, because it's not Christian, in quotes. And have plenty of relatives and people that I grew up with that had that experience, that weren't allowed to like, consume stuff outside of Christian media, which I think was a shame, honestly. And definitely not the way I'll raise my kids, for sure. But I grew up with stuff like Adventures in Odyssey, a lot of radio shows. Jungle Jam is another one. Just radio shows that would put on a story, and then they have a lesson, and somebody talk about the lesson at the end to kind of summarize it. Adventures in Odyssey is a perfect example of that. I feel like, though, the writers of Adventures in Odyssey in certain scenarios would go too far. In fact, they would get in trouble from Christian parents and Christian individuals because they would kind of go too far. Like there's a whole episode arc where some kids are like trying to infiltrate this house that's like broken down and abandoned in town. And then you find out that and it doesn't matter. I can spoil it, but it's like 35, 40 years old at this point. But it had a really, it was like took off of radios because it had you found out the house had like a chained up individual that was like a family member, and he deformed and grew into this weird kind of individual, and he sounded weird too. And it was like a lost episode you couldn't find because it was only on syndication for like a couple weeks, and then I remember listening to cassette tapes and listening to that episode and being freaked the F out. 'Cause as a kid, I'm like, this is messed up. Holy crap. But I love how Adventures in Odyssey would continue to do what they wanted, regardless of if parents got mad or not. Versus something like VeggieTales, which I also grew up with. And when they changed the bunny song, you know what I mean, David? Like, the bunny. Oh, I love the bunny. For the Shadrach, Meshach, and Benny episode, in the Chocolate Factory. And I remember when they changed it because of the backlash, I was like, that's so stupid. And our thought process of them
changed it?
They changed it because in the song he says like, the bunny, oh, I love the bunny. And the girls and the backup singers later on say, I don't want to play it. I don't want something, honey. I just want to play it in a fork in the bunny. And the guy like is agreeing with them singing. He's like, yeah, because he's the bad guy. He's the king of whatever, the Chocolate Factory, you know? So parents got mad because they glorifies the negativity of the episode, which is what the good guys were fighting against. And so they changed it and called it the new and improved bunny song, and changed it to where the guy who's singing it, who's supposed to be the evil king, is saying, no, girls, I learned my lesson. You should stay away from all that chocolate, you know, as a lesson.
Wait.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've seen that episode.
Uh-huh.
I'm pretty sure the new bunny song was just part of the episode from the beginning.
No, it wasn't. The original version had, and I'm sure people can look this up online, but the original version had those original lyrics. And because of backlash, they changed it. I don't know if they changed it in the release of the episode later on.
But whoa.
Okay.
The episode, as I watched it,
yeah,
there's a whole character arc because it's the VeggieTales version of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah.
So the big boss pickle cucumber guy who's the evil, who's the bad guy, represents Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes.
And in the story of Nebuchadnezzar throwing Daniel's companions into the fire because they wouldn't worship the whatever it was, they, you know, like he had at the end of the episode, or at the end of the story, like Nebuchadnezzar is changed.
Okay. So, okay, you continue. Sorry, I found it.
So
continue.
So when I watched the episode as a kid, they sang the bunny song, but then once he threw Rack Shack and Benny into the furnace or whatever it was, I don't remember if they were actually that violent in the VeggieTales version.
Yeah, it was a furnace. Yeah, they threw him in there. Yeah,
and they didn't. They were protected. He comes around and he's like, oh, wait, I was wrong this whole time to make people worship the bunny anyway. And then he sings the new bunny song.
Oh, really? Because I don't remember that at all.
I don't remember any backlash about that.
It's been a while since I've heard about it. But the quote that he says that people had an issue with, and the first time he sings it, is he says, I won't go to church and I won't go to school. That stuff is for sissies, but bunnies are cool. And because of that quote, parents got mad and sent letters to Big Idea about that song.
So did they maybe just change the lyrics of that part? I think they just
changed the lyrics of that part and released the new and improved bunny song.
But the new and improved bunny song was part of the episode anyway.
Really was? I don't remember that. So
because he
sings that at the end? Because I don't remember him singing at the end.
I don't know. Maybe maybe there's two different versions floating around.
Well, so that's the original version. This is on the fandom website for Big Idea. Wow, bigidea.fandom.com, guys. And then the current version, he says, come out and play. Oh, instead of church and school, he says, I won't eat no beans and I won't eat tofu. That stuff is for sissies, but bunnies are cool.
Oh, okay.
So they changed it.
So they changed changed the Evil Bunny song.
They changed the Evil Bunny song because of back.
Yeah.
And this was in 95.
Okay. Yeah, it's
weird, huh?
That's really dumb.
Yeah.
It's weird and dumb.
So here's the thing. And then we'll move on from Inversion Odyssey and VeggieTales. Unless we want to keep diving into VeggieTales. But Invention Odyssey did not back down. Maybe they wouldn't release the episode in syndication again. That was creepy. There was one about D&D, I remember. That was totally like Satanic Panic, about like them playing Castles and Cauldrons instead of
Castles and Cauldrons
instead of Dungeons and Dragons. And there was like a whole scene near the end of the episode where the friend that's the bad influence is like summoning a literal demon.
Oh.
Like and it's like supposed to be, don't play this because there's Satan in it. But that aside, there was much more positivity and much more good and well-written stuff in that kind of form, in that radio form, versus then I would say VeggieTales, and was much smarter and much more resilient to like the Satanic Panic crowd, you know?
Yeah.
Or the freaking out Christian folks.
See, that's interesting too, because coming from a worldview perspective, I'd be interested to find out later, like, what the creators of Adventures in Odyssey are up to now, because it's one thing about the VeggieTales creator is, he went full progressive.
Yeah. Which I saw a video about Matt Walsh talking about it, and I need to watch it. I haven't watched it yet.
Oh, apparently
he does not like I Am a Racist for some reason.
Yep.
I have no knowledge about that topic.
Yeah, he basically the gist
so what
of
did
it.
He say?
So I watched the Matt Walsh episode talking about it.
Okay.
Basically the gist of it is,
and which sorry, go for it.
Basically the gist of it is the creator of VeggieTales, like, basically did this like, you know, like Zoom call podcast type thing with a couple other people who were also like progressive left-leaning Christians, just basically dunking on Am I Racist and Matt Walsh in general for what I would say are really nonsensical reasons.
Interesting.
How they were like, you know, it's un-Christ-like because, you know, he was playing a character and all the
what
crap like that, you know?
What the heck?
Yeah.
I thought Matt Walsh is Catholic.
He is.
So why is Phil Vischer having beef with a Catholic guy?
It's because of worldview. It's because Phil Vischer is a leftist, and Matt Walsh is a traditional conservative.
Interesting. Huh.
That's my analysis of the situation.
Yeah.
Because the reasons why they're dunking on Am I Racist seem really nonsensical and bizarre to me. And the only thing I can think of is that they want to attack him for being conservative and say that that's not very Christian, that's un-Christ-like, but they obviously can't do that. So they invent other reasons to say that he's not being Christ-like. And maybe they don't do it consciously. Maybe that's sort of a subconscious thing that they do, but from the way I see it, that's kind of what I think they're doing. Because that's the only... Unless they're just, you know... Unless Phil Vischer has just, like, you know, like... His IQ has like gone down 50 points in the last 10 years or something. That's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, I wonder, because I remember... I didn't read all of it, but... oh shoot, what was the book he wrote about being Bob? Or was it the other guy that wrote it? Phil Vischer, like, book. Dang it. It's like If They Call Me Bob. I own it. I read like half of it. It's like If They Call Me Bob, or What Bob Taught Me, or something. And it was a really interesting book about the history of VeggieTales and diving deep from his perspective and diving deep into it, and how like there's a ton of stuff in the history of it. And it's really fascinating, like how Barney sued the company and how they lost a ton of money, and how the Jonah movie bankrupted them basically in like the early 2000s and all this crazy stuff. But it's interesting that he would kind of succumb to the quote woke movement, or have, I don't know, maybe he just has critiques and doesn't like I Am a Racist. Maybe that could be it too. But I really want to, like, later on look up that stuff and figure out what's going on, because it seems fascinating. But I think that I don't want to jump off into the discussion in my head, but to go back to Adventures in Odyssey real quick, I believe the original creators are still making them and writing them. And they still go, and Jess Harnell, who plays Wooten, who also played Wacko in a number of other roles as well. Wacko in what's it called?
Animaniacs.
He's a very notable voice actor. He plays Wooten, who's been like a main character since the early 2000s. And he's like one of the main reasons why they keep going. And he loves Adventures in Odyssey. I think he's a Christian. I could be wrong, but he's stuck with it forever and still works with them. But I think the original creators are still going. The original writer I know is still going. And they switched out voice actors and stuff, but the chick who plays Connie is still playing Connie. And they still do live shows. They make their money from selling CDs and digital versions of the albums, and they keep going. And Lexi's a great person to talk about this, because she loves Adventures in Odyssey and she follows them even to this day. So, and she even has they have subscription. I forgot to mention this. They have an app for Adventures in Odyssey, and it's a subscription, and it's like $5 a month or something, and you have access to all the albums. So if you're like into that and you're nostalgic for that.
So it's like Netflix for Adventures in Odyssey, basically?
Basically, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but they never switch them out or anything.
That's
what I remember.
It's pretty baller.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I don't really care about Adventures in Odyssey that much. I've literally never listened to or whatever an episode of any of them. But that's pretty baller.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty anyway, so back on topic. That's the kind of media I grew up watching and listening, consuming too. But I think it's interesting that this dynamic of Christian media and the creators who make it and the people in the 70s, 80s, 90s who went off and just made stuff for themselves or for other people because they wanted to make that stuff, versus I'm going to make this thing because it's a Christian thing, or I'm going to do it to better the world. I mean, if you're an artist and you do that, that's cool. But I feel like as a Christian, it's kind of weird to see that as an adult today, because I feel like you can still create media that isn't Christian, but it's Christian people making it. I mean, just look at this podcast. We're not like a Christian podcast, but we are Christians and we're open and we talk about that kind of stuff. We talk about Jesus, like straight up.
Do we? Are you sure?
I think so.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, straight up, bro. But I don't know, David. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff I grew up listening and watching too. But I kind of want to go into a discussion, but I feel like there's more to talk about in this kind of realm, though, because I think about that one Smash Mouth song where they talk about those the hippie chicks line in gosh dang it, I'm blanking on the song. What is it, David? I'm gonna look at my Spotify real quick.
Hippie chicks?
Yeah, the hippie chick. No, ain't no joke. Oh dang, what's it called?
Are you talking about Walking on the Sun?
Yeah, Walking on the Sun.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about the line where they go like, those hippie chicks were all hypocrites. And this is in the 90s they said this. And it's kind of like that generation calling back to their parents' generation saying, hey, you kind of screwed everything up for us.
Yeah.
And you talked about love and tolerance and all this stuff, but all it brought was war and damnation and moral decay in our society.
Well, also it's like, you had the boomers grew up in the, the summer of love and
Yeah.
all this and that, and they were the hippies. But then when they grew up, they became corporate jerk-offs, just like the, just like the generation before,
Yeah, well, I don't want to get into blaming different generations. But
Yeah, that was more a joke.
But I think you need to talk about it because, I mean, look at this last election. I think, was it Gen X were like the biggest generation that like brought Trump back in, as far as I'm aware. And I thought that was really cool because I'm like, oh, dang, like those folks that are starting to get into their 50s and 60s now, which is kind of crazy to think of. But those folks are now like, they're demanding the change in culture and change in leadership as well. And a lot of folks, especially millennials, kind of rag on them like, oh, Gen X, that's why Gen Y is messed up. And that's why Gen Z is even more messed up. And it's like, what are you guys talking about?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't get into the whole intergenerational blah, blah, blah. But I feel like Gen X specifically.
I just feel like it's relevant to like what we're talking about in terms of Christian media and the moral decay and all that stuff.
I feel like Gen X were definitely orphaned, morally speaking, more so than any other generation. Because the boomers boomers sort of grew up during the whole free love thing. So the boomers grew up in a time of great transition, but Gen X grew up after that transition had already taken place. So they just didn't have, and I think when you look at like late 80s and early 90s media, you can really see that it was just like that generation in particular was, I think, more lost, morally speaking, than generations before them.
Yeah, I think of my my parents and them telling us how they would go to like a Carmen concert back in the day, and then I think Carmen was in the 80s and 90s, and pretty notable Christian artist, I would say, who made a really terrible movie as well that we're only going to mention once more in this episode.
That's not the only terrible thing he made.
No.
But I digress.
But yeah, I digress. But I remember them talking about the like kind of the Jesus revolution and kind of the culture reacting to the moral decay and shoot, I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I apologize. But I think of what they were going through when, they got married and they started having kids and they started, they were looking at the culture in the 80s and 90s and stuff, and they were looking at that and they're saying, man, where is this world going to? Like, it's probably going to be ending soon the way it looks like with all the wars and stuff like that. And I think of how their worldview from that perspective and our worldview today of we're in the 2020s now, and we know the context, we know our history, we know it's very well archived now, and how it went from like moral decay to Jesus revolution pretty quickly. And that was kind of, I would say, the Judeo-Christian movement against the culture. But I feel like out of it also sprung up stuff like VeggieTales, Adventures in Odyssey, and people who witnessed stuff like that then went out to create specifically Christian media as a response to it. But I think the only issue is it's kind of preaching to the choir in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. And I feel like you can still give the gospel without even mentioning Jesus by just showing love. That's just how the real world works. But I feel like in terms of when it comes to culture and media and changing the culture, you do have to create culture. But I feel like you need to be more tactful now, not just stuff made for Christian audiences.
Well, if you're going to create culture, you need to actually be able to engage with the population at large and not just people who already agree with you.
And I feel like there's a perfect balance you can find in that. And we haven't seen it yet in, in our lifetime yet, but I feel like we will see it, where it's a mixture of somebody's passionate about something, they want to create it. They also want to glorify God in the process and tell a wonderful message. And it's able to reach a huge, vast number of folks. Because regardless of whether you want to make something to change the world, I would rely on, well, what are you passionate about? What story do you want to tell? What stuff is your own experience that you have learned and grew up and all this stuff? How can you bring your version of a story to the table? I think you should rely on your creative and your passion first, and then you can also like combine that with your beliefs and combine it with, like, say, if you're a Christian or whatever, or heck, even a Muslim or whatever, like the market will decide if it's successful or not in the end.
Yeah.
But also the folks that the audience will also decide in the end as well. So anyway, that's just a thing. I think it has to do with a lot of authenticity as well. And if you're really about something, and if you're really passionate about something, but also there is a difference between good media and bad media, and good art and bad art, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like art can be art. Like a rock sitting in New York can be art, sure. But is it good art? It's debatable.
Very, very debatable.
So I tried to get into a discussion with one of my coworkers about this, and we didn't have a whole lot of time to talk about it, but I thought it was interesting. He's like, well, yeah, it could be art. And I was like, well, yeah, but is it good art or bad art? Like, am I going to want to look at this rock? It's like, oh, it's so amazing. Like you look in, like you take a college class, you're like, wow, even a rock can be art, and all this crazy stuff, splatter of paint on a blank canvas, But I feel like we're past that now. We need to start talking about and making things that are kind of authentic to you, is kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah,
and
maybe something more timeless.
Timeless, yeah.
Because you talk about, paint being splattered. So the thing that comes to mind is Jackson Pollock.
Yeah.
Jackson Pollock is interesting for about 5 minutes. But unless you're in a very, very specific sort of like what I would call the elite artsy fartsy intelligentsia sort of upper crust, after about 5 minutes of looking at a Jackson Pollock painting and going, that's interesting, you move on with your life and you never look at it again. Mm-hmm. Whereas, something like
something that is timeless.
Something a little more timeless, like say you have a beautiful landscape painting that you hang on your wall, and maybe you don't stare at it every day, but you look at it, and occasionally you find yourself, if it's a good painting, if it's a truly great painting, even though it doesn't have any novel techniques, it's using bog standard painting techniques that have been around since the Renaissance period, but if it's a truly great painting, you're going to look at it like, maybe a week from the time you first put it up, or a month from the time you first put it up, or a year, however long it is, and you're going to see something in there that you didn't quite see before, and you're like, whoa, that's kind of cool. And then you move on with your life, but it's that process sort of repeats itself. You have moments where you engage with this painting. You're like, wow, I never noticed this, how beautiful this certain section of it is. You just don't get that with, say, Jackson Pollock. Or I guess I won't speak for everybody, but I'm confident that most people who are even remotely interested in art probably don't have that same experience with Jackson Pollock paintings.
Well, I think that's a great example, David, that you bring up, because it's like, to my mind, what brings to my mind is, well, yeah, I could put a Jackson Pollock painting up, and yeah, sure, that's cool. But if I put up something with like more clear, like more relatable things, I'm going to be looking at that more often. Like if it's specifically of a beautiful landscape, there's more depth, there's more vision, that kind of thing. But also, it's important to remember that, I think it's part. I don't know where I want to go with this, but to my mind, it comes to it where I think of like relatability. I think of like stuff that will make people want to revisit your art, stuff like that. I don't really know where to go with this, but that's what was running through my head as you were describing that.
Yeah, so it actually kind of dovetails into one of the things I wanted to talk about, which was the sort of tension of novelty and timelessness. So good art has got to bring something fresh to the table, right? Because like in my example of a beautiful landscape painting that, use the same Renaissance era techniques that have been around for hundreds of years, for it to be a truly great painting, it can't just be a copy of something that came before it. There's got to be some kind of touch to it, which brings something fresh, or at least for the people who connect with it. It's fresh for them. It might not be fresh for other people, but it's at least fresh for certain people.
And that's where authenticity comes in. In terms of what you create. Like, I mean, think of stuff like Metropolis back in the 1920s. If you're going to remake that, that'd be pretty cool. But to have Tama Tezuka to remake that in like the year 2000, I believe, to look at it in that perspective, vastly different and vastly like novel and cool,
Yeah, so there's sort of a balance there. So like,
and also you can use the same techniques to paint a picture, but it really is more about the vision and your choice in that,
Yeah. So it's like, it's all about the balance because, like I said, Jackson
I guess we're getting
Pollock,
into art philosophy now.
Yeah. Well,
but it's relevant to what we're talking about.
Jackson Pollock is all novelty, all fresh technique, nothing to really hold on to. Whereas Thomas Kincaid is kind of, the opposite. You look at a Thomas Kincaid painting and you think of like, the puzzles that your grandma used to put together. Not to bag on Thomas Kincaid fans, because I'm sure there's scores of them that listen to Snarp.
Scores of them.
But why I brought that up is I kind of wanted to talk about sort of our experiences with with sort of the sacred versus the secular.
Ooh.
And any sort of like observations we might have made about the two different approaches that those forms of creativity have. Because like I said before, you're in the 20th century, you basically had art and media that was for the general population, that was made from a secular sort of liberal perspective. And then you had this sort of subset of media that was designed for a traditional conservative evangelical audience. And you had a very vast difference in approach to these things. So like a good example of that from my experience is going back to around the 70s or so, the 60s and 70s, as it relates to music. Because I grew up, despite growing up in the church, I grew up listening to primarily music from the 60s and 70s when I was much younger.
The good stuff.
Some of it was good. Some of it was not. But, and I, growing up in the church, I heard plenty of Christian music from that era too, because, just the nature of things like hymnals as they collect music from over the years. So there's plenty of songs like As the Deer that we sang in church that are from that same period. So it's like one artist that really made a big impact on me growing up, and I think I've discussed this before, is Pink Floyd. Their album Dark Side of the Moon was like, because they were of the era of music that I grew up listening to, but their songs weren't the kind of songs that would have been played on the radio. So, but I had always heard of Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, mostly because, Target sold their t-shirts. But
For some reason.
But I mean, that speaks to the influence on the culture that band and that particular album had.
Yeah.
And so eventually, when I was old enough, I think it was in high school, I sought out the CD and bought it for myself and listened to it, and I was just blown away by it. It was like, even though it was old by that point, I could see how fresh it was, how fresh it would have been in the era that it came out in, because I had already grown up listening to the music of that era. So I could hear how fresh it would have been, and I could also hear how how it had influenced things that came later, that were more of my era, like 90s and early 2000s stuff. And so it was a monumental moment in my creative life. Hearing that album, it completely changed the way I thought of music. And then you contrast that approach. You contrast that approach because if you know anything about that, what they were trying to do when they recorded that album is they were trying to push the boundaries. They were trying to say, what can we do to be creative, to make something fresh that nobody's ever heard before, but that's still good. And so you see that approach to it, and then you contrast that with a popular Christian song from the 70s is the hymn As the Deer, which I'm sure you've heard plenty of times.
Oh, countless.
Yes. And you contrast that, it's a nice tune. And if there's moments that hearing it might bring back some nostalgia because, grew up in church listening to it. But it's really just, it was written specifically for people to sing in church and to be inoffensive, easy to sing, all that kind of thing. It wasn't designed to challenge or provoke at all. So it was like, so you see what I'm getting at, the kind of difference in approach. And, one made a difference in the culture, and one made a difference in the very insulated realm that was American evangelical Christianity. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's where I think that we are, is basically we're to this point where if Christians want to engage with a wider culture, we have to figure out how to make things that actually get people's attention, that actually, push boundaries, that are thought-provoking. We can't make things for ourselves anymore, kind of a thing. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, no, I get you. I want to ask you this. Are you talking about more as Christians, we need to be more mindful about our intentionality in creation?
Yeah, I think we need to be
Because
more intentional in the way we create things,
Hmm.
because I think Christian creatives so far create Christian content for Christian audiences. So I think we need to be more intentional about creating art that isn't just Christian art for Christian audiences.
I think, let me bring up a really great example of that. When me and Angie, last week's episode was our deep dive into Haunting of Hill House. And I kind of wanted to do it because it was something me and her really wanted to talk about, because of the blatant Christian themes, or basically like more religious themes you see, whether it be Christian or Catholicism or whatever, but the themes you see in that series. And it's really beautiful. And it's really beautiful because it has a huge message about forgiveness in the family, about how love conquers all, in this show that's supposed to be about ghosts and being spooky. But it's funny because you take somebody like the guy who made it, like Mike Flanagan, who created the show for TV and Netflix, but you take that guy and it makes me really want to dive into what his intention was, because you see like, oh, this guy's known for horror. He's known for really good, suspenseful films and stuff like that, and breakout movies he's made, independent stuff. And then he does this Netflix series, which is based on the works of Shirley Jackson, and her stuff is so drab and depressing. To take that and to introduce hope into it, and also a lot of techniques in writing and characters of his own spin, it's really beautiful to see something executed so well. And I don't know the full intentions behind it. And I think that's the beautiful thing about it that I've seen so far, is that I see there are obvious Christian themes in this show that is rated MA, that does have all this other stuff in it. But the show is basically about love does conquer all, and unity in the family and all this kind of stuff. And it's really beautiful. But I look at that, and it's definitely not advertised as Christian, and it definitely shouldn't be, for sure. But there's a message in there that's really, really poignant and valuable, I think, for society. And you can find it in this show that has ghosts in it. And I think it's really cool. But I don't know. I don't know if I have a specific example like your Pink Floyd and As the Deer example. I remember listening to like Owl City growing up and being like mesmerized by, I can't remember the guy, Adam Young, the guy who wrote all those songs and the techno and pop and stuff and early YouTube. But I don't have a specific example for that, but I think of me listening to it and how I connected with that kind of music. And I also think of stuff like Reliant K, and these all happen to be Christian artists too, but I just really love their art. Like Owl City is, I guess, a Christian artist. He definitely is. He talks about God in some of the songs, but some of them have nothing to do with God. And they're just weird, abstract lyric writing that's very bizarre, but fun to listen to, I guess. But I kind of rest on that kind of thing where he's not really advertising 100% of the time that you're a Christian, but you are intentional of what you want to write about. And specifically that goes with Reliant K, who is a Christian artist, or were, I would guess, Christian artists. They're kind of more secular now. But dude, some of those albums I go back and listen to as a young guy, and I listen to them and I'm like, man, this is like talking exactly about what I'm going through. I think of like the ums and the don'ts and all that stuff, and like the album and Anatomy of the Tongue and the Birds and the B-Sides, Two Lefts Don't Make a Right. All those albums have a tons of songs in them that really kind of speak to young men. I've also seen some songs from The Fray that do that, and just stuff you really connect to. And I would agree with you that we need to be more intentional about our creativity and the media we make, especially in the era we're in, and also in the era we might potentially go forward in. I think it goes back to like, oh, we got to get ready for the great revival. But no, I feel like the Great Revival, I feel like it's not going to happen all at once, but it's going to build and build upon itself, and we need to be ready for that. And in the process of doing it, I think it is introducing it's kind of interesting because we talked about McCarthyism and stuff like that, and oh man, they're sneaking communist stuff into this media. How dare they? And then you look at Hollywood, and then they're blatantly showing satanic stuff in all their films.
Yeah.
Or the music industry specifically. But I did want to bring up this, David, specifically with music. We'll talk about Christian films later, but with Christian music, it's its own genre for sure, or its own type of music. But it kind of for me goes, it's kind of interesting because there's not a whole lot of bad Christian music that I've seen or listened to, because you can relate to it just being worship, and that's just their way of worshiping.
I would beg to differ, but
go for it. And my argument is, I go to like Reliant K, and I love listening to them, right? But I also don't want to go and listen to all hymns all the time, you know?
Yeah.
You know, like I love listening to like the early Lecrae albums, be like, yeah, we're going to change the culture. This is awesome. Yeah. But it's specifically Christian rap as a reaction to the culture and the moral decay and the secularism, you know?
Yeah. And see, that's, it just comes down to taste, because
sure.
I personally,
I know you're not a big Reliant K guy.
I personally don't love listening to Reliant K.
You don't like Marilyn Manson, My Girlfriend, you know? You don't listen to that banger. But anyway, continue.
But I do want to bring up something kind of interesting too, is it's kind of funny when you grow up listening to a lot of Christian media, or consuming a lot of Christian media, whether it be Christian books, movies, music, what have you, you know, the effect that some of this can have upon you is quite profound, you know, and it's kind of interesting is, in the rush to sort of, you know, pull people away from worldly influences and provide, you know, media that could be a sort of a substitute for secular media for, you know, kids growing up in evangelical Christian households. It kind of produced a falling away from Christianity in its own weird way, because what you see is what you saw in, I would say, the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s, is you had a sort of culture of looking up, of young Christian people looking up to prominent figures who were creators of Christian media. And it was almost like we were getting our morals, and we were getting our getting our worldview from this media instead of from our parents trying to teach us the Bible or whatever. And that's just normal, because kids are always rebellious to a certain degree, even kids that grow up in good Christian homes.
You mean especially in Christian homes?
Yes. So it kind of produced an interesting effect. You have these figures exercise so much influence over young believers, and then come to find out that many of them may not have even been true believers in the first place. It's very interesting.
Yeah, there's a ton of examples like that where artists come out later on and they renounce the gospel, or they convert to something else, or they claim they're agnostic or atheist.
Yeah, I want to go over a couple examples.
What are some examples of those?
The biggest ones I feel like. So you have, first example is the author. I can't remember his name, but the guy who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye. So that book had a huge influence on purity culture within evangelical circles.
Joshua Harris?
Yes. And it profoundly shaped the lives of many, many young people. And its influence, I would say, lasts to this day. I was just reading on, I never grew up in an environment that was purity obsessed, but a lot of young believers of my generation did. And it still affects them, because I was reading, scrolling through Facebook, and I saw a post from someone who I grew up with, and who grew up evangelical just like I did, and she was talking about going back to church, and I don't know how long she stopped going to church or whatever, but I don't know if this post was talking about recent events or if it was kind of looking back to something. But she talked about going back to church as an adult, and then being married and finding that the men in her church were uncomfortable being around her if her husband left the room.
Interesting.
Like they would, they'd be like, in a social setting talking, and then the husband leaves the room for a second. And so I'm presuming she's having a conversation with some other dude who is also a married man himself. And maybe his wife's not in the room right now. Maybe she was somewhere else. But suddenly these two people are in the room with each other, and they're not married to each other. And they're alone together,
yeah, of course, yeah.
And like she was talking about this other man in the room, like looking very uncomfortable. Like I guess this happened in more than one situation. Like in one situation, this guy she was talking to, having a conversation with, trying to get to know, kind of a thing, kind of like left the room real fast after her husband stepped out. And then another time she was talking about how he basically, the other guy she was talking to, like her husband stepped out of the room again, and this other guy she was talking to, having a conversation with, like kind of just like, wouldn't look at her, like basically like pretended she didn't exist until her husband came back into the room. And it's like, so I didn't really grow up in like that serious amount of purity culture, but other people did. And, it's had interesting effects on people who grew up as evangelicals in my generation. And so Joshua Harris comes out and he says he doesn't believe in God anymore. And, well, maybe he doesn't disbelieve in God, but he doesn't believe in the God of the Bible anymore. And from the way he talks about his deconversion, so to speak, it doesn't sound like, it kind of sounds like, I don't want to, it's not my place to judge.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of sounds like he never truly knew Jesus to begin with.
Ooh, really? From what it sounds like.
From what it sounds like. And, you know, and now all of a sudden too, he's like putting out posts on social media where he's like apologizing to the gays about how they've been treated by the church and all that, you know. He's like literally just like abandoned the pretense of evangelicalism or conservatism at all and is completely just like totally secular, has basically become a leftist, just like Phil Vischer did.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Your example of your friend and the guy being uncomfortable in the room. I mean, I was definitely like exposed to like purity culture, but I never read that book, never even heard of it until like later teens, maybe adulthood. Like it never really crossed my path. I'm sure my siblings definitely read it or something like that, but it never really came into my view. But that whole situation sounds like it's confusing. Sometimes I've noticed this, like just in retrospective over my life, sometimes purity can blend in with insecure behavior really well. And I think personally, from just observing that kind of situation, it's insecurity taking its place of maturity. And yes, resisting temptation is important, but we're adults. Like, come on. And you're both married to other people. Like, it's just, to me, sounds completely ridiculous. And I just, you know, it's just weird, you know?
It is ridiculous.
But that being a spawn of that kind of culture, which I'm familiar with as well, in a sense, but like, look at the results of that, you know? And it's just, that's the result of the purity culture. And there's nothing wrong with purity. In fact, I encourage purity among, you know, all folks. I mean, if it is too much of a temptation, remove yourself from the situation. I totally understand that. But in that kind of scenario, it just reminds me of just somebody being kind of just insecure and wants to obey rules and just, I'm not going to do that because, you know, yeah. I'm scared of her husband or for whatever reason, you know.
What I think in that situation, what I think is the main driver of that is fear.
Yes.
They've been instilled with this fear that if you don't, you know, that if you are alone in a room with a woman you're not married to for just slightly too long, then you know, like you're you know, you're just going to be overcome with lust and all sorts of bad things are going to happen. Yeah. And, you know, obviously, if you're a married person, there's certain boundaries that you put in place.
Absolutely.
You know, there's certain levels of closeness and intimacy that you have with your wife that you don't have with the women who are not your wife.
Yeah.
But one thing that I think the sort of overboard purity culture that I've seen, I never experienced it personally because, like I said, I didn't grow up in excessive purity culture, but I know people who have, and that I think that's kind of what that produces is like a fear of temptation to where you have to set your boundaries at a place that seems a little ridiculous in order to feel safe from temptation.
Yeah. I could be totally wrong in this, what I'm about to say, but it's just from complete observation and from what people have told me as well and seeing what they have to say. It's kind of like you're engaged to somebody for so friggin' long and you finally get married, that once you do be intimate with that person, it feels wrong because of the overbearing purity culture, even though you have every right to do what you want with each other because you're married. So whatever. But that also is a product of that. It kind of reminds me of the product of over-sexualizing and our culture in general, and the effect of porn especially, because that leaves a huge amount of shame on people. That is very much fear-inducing and insecurity-inducing to the individual as well. And it's funny because from what I'm not married, but from what I've talked with other folks who are married, that's an interesting thing to take away from it. That I'm not saying those have the same results, over purity or not purity at all, but it's interesting how fear can be in both of those things.
Yeah.
Even with good intentions of making a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Was it even made in good intentions? It makes you question everything after the guy came out and just rescinded everything. It reminds me of the chick who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and they made the movie with Julia Roberts. She, as they were making the movie, I believe she came out and she stated she seeks God, and she's not necessarily Christian, but she did say a lot of things that people say, oh my God, is she a Christian? That rescinds Eat, Pray, Love, because it's all about being new age and finding yourself spiritually, but without God in general. But the fact that she's seeking God is interesting, but it just rescinds every work she's done before that in terms of Eat, Pray, Love. And also Phil Vischer's an interesting topic too. It might just be, maybe he's just looking for relevancy. I'm kind of coping at this moment because, he's a creator of VeggieTales and I kind of admire him in that way, but nobody's perfect. And that's the thing. That's why we shouldn't have people on a pedestal like that. So I don't know. That's just what I was thinking as you were regaling me with the topic of purity culture, but it's funny. Again, it's interesting how fear is a big aspect of both of those.
Yeah. And I mean, fear is kind of the original driver for this, I think, anyway, because as far as I can tell.
Well, also, it's the big driver for the satanic panic thing.
Yeah.
It was totally fear-based.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. You have starting really to take off in the 80s, I would say, is you had this fear among evangelicals about what was taking place in culture, and so their response to sort of pull away and create their own evangelical sort of subculture, I think was a fear response, because it's not if the culture shifts, we need to do everything that they're doing. We need to look like the world. Far from it. We should absolutely look different than the world. But our response to culture doesn't have to be rooted in fear of engaging with the culture.
Yes. That's right.
I think that's, too, where a lot of this LGBTQ sort of stuff has come from, is that the idea that we can see in society that increasing acceptance and visibility of homosexual behavior is a sure sign of moral decay, of cultural decadence. I mean, it happened to the Greeks, it happened to the Romans.
Yeah. It's a pattern.
Yeah, it's definitely a pattern for sure. And so when that started happening in Western culture, I think people had the same fear response. And now that's why being gay is such a hot topic, even though it really shouldn't be. I mean, so for our more left-leaning friends, we believe the Bible.
We love you
here.
guys.
Yeah.
Jesus loves you.
Hold on.
Jesus loves you, but we don't. No, I'm joking.
Hold on.
I'm joking.
Hold on. So, we don't hate anyone for particular life choices or what they think about themselves or anything like that. But the Bible is pretty clear that it condemns homosexual behavior. It doesn't mean that God doesn't love gay people, but the Bible clearly condemns homosexual behavior. And so get that out of the way.
Yep.
Because when we talk about engaging with the culture, we don't want to compromise on truth. We never want to compromise on truth. So with that in mind, I'll go back to what I was saying. I think
I support you, David. Keep going.
I think what happened is the evangelicals had a fear response to homosexuality instead of treating it like any other sin.
Yeah.
Where we could have, and engage with the culture on it, have an honest back and forth about what the culture says about it versus what God says about it. But I think what happened is evangelicals had a fear response to homosexuality, and so now all the stories you hear of people being disowned by their parents because they came out as gay and whatever, I think a lot of people were driven into the arms of the quote-unquote LGBTQ movement by evangelicals.
Yeah.
Who, in their fervor to stamp out the gay from among their ranks.
What a funny phrase. Continue. I'm sorry. Let's
Not
spend any more.
It was intended to be funny.
It was intended. Okay. Well, you got me. David made a motion with his foot as he was saying that, and I was just looking at his foot. I'm like, man, that's really funny.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I think a lot of the ways that evangelicals have dealt with homosexuality has been from fear and not from a desire to engage with the culture in truth and love. And I think that's actually caused a lot of the problems that we have today in regards to what Christians think about sexuality versus what the world thinks about sexuality. I think part of the reason why the divide got pushed so much further than it did and why the conversation seems so much harder to have than it should be is partially to do with evangelicals reacting to homosexuality in fear rather than in an honest desire to engage with the culture.
Well, I think it's basically the evangelicals and I think it's basically fear is a tool, and I feel like when you try to use a tool that the devil is so familiar with, it never ends up good for Christians using the opposite of what God provides for us. Like the evangelicals used fear and then cited it into the culture, into those who maybe thought they were gay or whatever, and drove them away into the arms of a different movement that has been arguably always been hijacked by extreme political leanings, 100%. But it's just sad because I think of like we were talking about the Satanic Panic. I think of Kevin Smith going to stand around protesting his own film Dogma to dunk on the people protesting his film. So he went out and he was with the protester like, this is terrible, this is against God and blah blah blah, and he was there, he's like, yeah, that it's against God and it's a terrible film and I'm here to support the movement against this movie, and he's the creator who directed it. And it's like he was trolling, obviously, but
yeah,
the fact that the movement, the first reaction to the moral decay of our society was we need to take it back by inciting fear, by saying you're going to go to hell if you support or consume this media. Like The Last Temptation of Christ comes to my mind, where people were outside the movie theater also kind of being violent in some instances. If you look back in interviews and stuff, like in the interview, these folks, they were mad and they were angry, and it's like, it's just a movie, man, and you're just putting more attention on it that way, and you're only making yourselves look bad, and you're making other evangelicals and Christians look bad as well. And not because of a lack of tolerance, but of, I don't know what else it could be. But
yeah,
in hindsight, looking at that film, and the protesters with it, the protesters are in a much negative light now in our society than just in hindsight, I guess. But I don't know. I think it's weird. The fact that fear, I think, again, going back to that, I think it is fear that that has been used as a tool to drive folks away from God. And it's really unfortunate, whether it's being, you're going to go to hell, or other stuff. I mean, you remember those little Christian pamphlet books throughout the years at our church and at other churches, that'd be like
tracks.
The gospel or whatever they were called. And you read them and they're about really violent images of people going to hell and stuff, and how this guy redeems and goes through a redemption arc by just finding himself at a church one day. He was a drunkard, or he was a improprietary person or whatever. And he finds God, and everything's better, instantly better after he finds God. Doesn't talk about him growing a relationship with him. It just shows about his salvation. And it shows imagery of Satan and demons and all this stuff if you don't accept Christ, and which is true, comes back to truth. Like, that is true. But what was the quote? What was the thing you just said? You don't want to forsake truth for the sake of...
Yeah, so basically my view on sharing the gospel is we're called as Christians to speak the truth in love. And we need to engage with the culture with speaking truth in love as our sort of guiding principle. And also the Bible lays out, it clearly says it's the goodness of God that leads men to repentance. So that's the thing, is all those like gospel tracts and the weird the heavens, whatever, hell's gates plays.
Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames.
That's what it was. Those plays that try to, scare the hell out of people.
Literally.
I don't think that's
a successful way of selling Christianity to folks, or selling.
No, that's not, to me, that's not speaking the truth in love. To me, that's not trying to engage with the culture, in a straightforward, plain, and honest way.
Yeah. It's speaking truth in fear, almost.
Yeah, it's really, it's basically making use of fear. And the thing is, ultimately, God is the one who brings people to the point of salvation. It's not anything that we do.
Yeah.
So, people have been said that they were saved after they read a gospel tract, or they were saved after they, saw Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames. And that's all well and good. And the Lord can basically use anything, because honestly, he's full of mercy and grace. And he can figure out ways to turn all the terrible things we do to good somehow.
Yeah.
It's all like, salvation is, it's him. It's him and that person. The best we can do is plant seeds or water seeds that somebody else planted. But ultimately, that moment where they actually turn to the Lord and repent, and put their faith in Jesus, that's between them and the Lord. It has nothing to do with what we do. So, in a sense, I'm not necessarily like saying I'm like superior to all the people who have created these gospel tracts, or all this Christian media that I don't particularly enjoy or think is good.
It's just sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions, you know?
Yeah, so it's like, I'm not saying I'm superior to all these people. It's like, you know, they were just doing the best they could with what they had, or at least I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they were.
Yeah, I mean, let's be real. I'm a big hypocrite. Let me be clear, you know?
Yeah.
Like, sometimes we fall into that, you know?
Yeah, but
you know?
at the same time, just because I don't necessarily view myself as superior to somebody else doesn't mean we can't have an honest conversation about is this the best approach to share the gospel?
Yeah.
Is this art and media that Christians are creating, is it actually good, or is it?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, like, I mean, the things that keep me wanting to, or the things growing up, I should say, that have kept me, like, being a Christian, I guess, is to see good examples from other people and to see good examples of other folks in my life that have lived a good life and lived, like, you know, the way the Lord intended it to be. And I've also seen terrible examples of people who've made really bad mistakes, whether they're Christian or not Christian. And I see the results of those mistakes. And it's like, and you learn from your mistakes. I mean, I don't need to hear a gospel track I don't think anybody needs to hear that to become a Christian. They need to see it through God's love and the result of that love. I mean, can you imagine if the Christian right, in quotes, had a whole roundtable discussion at a very famous, notable church, like, say, I'm going to invoke his name. Say at Joel Osteen's church. They had that back in the day. They had a whole roundtable discussion that was live streamed on TV, that the benefits and not benefits of being a Christian, or the negatives of having a lifestyle of sodomy or whatever, you know? Like, can you imagine if they had a roundtable podcast style discussion about the ins and outs and the whatabouts about being gay and the negatives or positives of that? That'd probably be a little bit more productive, as cheesy as it quite sounds, you know, but versus being, you know, inciting fear in them. Like, if you claim to be this, you're kicked out of the family, or you're never receiving a Thanksgiving card, or I don't want to see you again in my life. Like, that's not right. Like, I've known parents that kick their kids out at 18 years old, and that's just not right. Come on, guys. There's better ways to be parents, you know, like, now, that's a whole different discussion. But you know, it's interesting how the reactionary, as known as the reactionary right or reactionary evangelicals, kind of, and I'm not grouping everybody in together. I'm just saying there was always people like that, you know. But again, I think it comes down to, you know, speaking truth in love, like you just said, and not resorting to fear, which is not a tool of God.
Exactly. I've always heard it said, and I think, you know, I would say that this lines up with what the word teaches, is that fear is the opposite of faith. So everything that we are supposed to do as believers has to come from faith. Jesus talks about, you know, the parable of the mustard seed and how it goes from being the smallest seed to being, you know, like a big old like shrub that's bigger than other garden plants, you know. And then in another passage he talks about having faith the size of a mustard seed. You can move mountains. So and then it also says elsewhere in scripture that, you know, basically faith is the only way to please God. Like, anything that we do that's not in faith, it doesn't matter what it is. It's not going to be pleasing to God if it's not done in faith. So faith is the tool that we should be using for everything.
Yeah.
And fear is essentially the opposite of that.
Yeah. And I would like to touch on the faith kind of thing, because in terms of like, instead of protesting The Last Temptation of Christ, what if they made a movie that was better than The Last Temptation of Christ? That would have been probably a better use of your time and resources and money. I was listening to Sean Bowles' podcast, and he was telling about this big, expensive movie that was made by Christians and that was released on YouTube. And that was tens of millions of dollars poured into this project. And it was going to be like this huge thing that God's going to use to preach to people and send out the word. And it's going to be awesome. And it was made in LA, and they had all the resources there they could afford, you know, with what they had, and tens of millions of dollars. And then they released it on YouTube for free, and nobody watched it. It has like 10,000 views. And it's like, that's it. And it's like, you got to be a little bit more tactful in the way you deliver your message, not just, you know, Jesus loves you is great, and that's the truth, and you got to speak truth in love. But there's also, since we live in a fallen world, you got to be more tactful in the way you deliver your message. I mean, just saying.
Yeah.
You got to be realistic.
Yeah, that's what the goal of good art is, and good media is finding ways to engage with the culture so that they're actually open to hearing your message.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that's kind of what we're lacking.
Mm.
That's kind of what we're lacking in today's society. We're so segmented, so polarized, that it seems like on certain topics we can't even have conversations with each other if we disagree on that topic.
Yeah.
Like, you know, us being Bible believing Christians, we believe that the Bible condemns homosexuality. But if I try to have a conversation with some random gay person, you know, 9 times out of 10, you know, I'm not going to say 9 times out of 10, but sometimes it seems like that.
It seems like that, yeah.
But a lot of the times, you just won't be able to have a productive conversation with that person because the divide in culture has become so vast that any attempt to challenge the way that they think about that certain subject can be interpreted as an attack on them personally, as saying, I hate them and I hate your identity and all this and that. And, you know, it's not to say that I'm immune to that sort of thing too, but, you know, I'm just giving an example of something that is hard to talk about in terms of like a big cultural issue.
The reason why I brought up tactfulness, David, is because we live in a society where basically the pitch for America is the best ideas will win, which is true. And that's why we have to be, you know, we have to present our ideas, you know, in truth, obviously, and in love. But also there's also the aspect of sometimes the best ideas in our culture are at the forefront and do win, even though they aren't the best ideas. I mean, you can just look at different ideologies and political influence over the culture, and sometimes those ideas aren't the best they can be, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like the effect it has on the culture. And like, I think it's I think it's mostly the fault of the LGBT movement that has prevented us from having a conversation like with a person who does live that way and whatnot, you know? I think it's their fault 100% that you can't have an evangelical and a gay person talk to each other and have an honest conversation. And when those kind of things are introduced in our culture, and thankfully, those conversations have been brought up. If you just go on YouTube and look it up, some of those conversations have been brought up, but a lot of it will be interrupted by noise and politics and all this kind of ideologically driven stuff, even belief driven stuff. And it's just unfortunate, but you also got to worry about like the YouTube kind of thing and the TikTok kind of thing where they will censor you or shadow ban you if you talk about certain things. And that's kind of another symptom of us, like a symptom of you can't talk about the taboo. You can't have an honest conversation. And we're going to justify what's taboo and what's not, you know, we're going to decide about that. And
that's the thing too.
Yeah.
It's like the marketplace of ideas in this country is no longer as free as it once was.
no.
And so, it's the same with any kind of marketplace, like you introduce external controls onto it, and then it changes the way it operates, and sometimes the outcome is not always the best. It's the same way with the marketplace of ideas. You try to control what ideas are acceptable to talk about, then you can have the side effect of the ideas that quote unquote win are not actually the best ideas.
Yeah. And yeah, it's fascinating to think about.
And also too, I think part of it is the crumbling of our moral values in the West, because the West used to be defined by common Judeo-Christian moral values. And so everything on the idea marketplace was judged according to those standards.
Yeah.
Nowadays, when you put an idea on the marketplace, it's judged by, the whims of the public at large. So sometimes you get like ideas that get really, really popular. I think because people no longer have that common, like bad ideas get really, really popular because people no longer have that common moral ground that they can use to.
They don't have that level. They don't have the rod of discernment, we'll say.
Yes.
They don't have a way to properly interpret that into something to contrast it with, which is unfortunate. But what about the big wins in our culture that have driven people to God? I think Christian music is definitely an avenue for that, and worship in general.
I've definitely seen some examples where there have been songs that have helped drive people closer to God, and I think ultimately, though, I think the real kicker is stuff that just can speak to people where they are is the most effective in my mind. So we've had pockets of it for sure, but nothing wide reaching, I would say. But we've had pockets of it. I've noticed a lot of, you go on listen to a worship song on YouTube, you'll see some people who have their testimony as they heard the song and that got them to started them on the journey to seeking God, and now they're saved. You'll see people who their testimony is they were saved through they watched some Christian movie or whatever. So there's pockets of it here and there, but I think we're not yet at a place where enough Christians are making media that speaks to people where they're at. But also there is glimmers of hope for a reversal of that trend.
Absolutely.
Let's see. We talked about Matt Walsh a little bit earlier, so I want to go back to him.
Okay. Yeah.
So he's
our good old Catholic friend, Matt Walsh.
Yeah.
Good old Catholic troll. Well, not a troll as in he's
for the
Catholic,
sake of argument, let's say For the sake of argument, let's say Catholics are Christians. No.
For the sake of argument. What? Well, at least we all believe Jesus existed. You know, that's important.
I'm messing around. I'm messing around.
Well,
I got nothing. I got nothing.
I got nothing.
I got nothing
against the Catholics. I got nothing against Mass.
I got plenty of disagreements with their theology.
Sure.
But disagreements with their theology is all it is. So I'm not going to go around saying
we can both fight the devil at the same time.
Yeah, just because I'm not going to say I'm not going to be the one to say if somebody's not a Christian just because they're a Catholic. But so yeah, anyway, Matt Walsh.
We love you, Catholics, or Catholic Snarp Fangle people.
Yes. The many Catholic
Snarp Fangles out there. We love you.
So yeah, Matt Walsh has gotten into movie making recently. He's done sort of like a couple of documentary style films. Yeah. He's done What Is a Woman and Am I Racist? And
which I've yet to see. I really want to watch them. Especially Am I Racist? It sounds really funny.
Yeah, I've seen What Is a Woman. I haven't seen Am I Racist yet. What Is a Woman definitely wasn't what you would call a comedy. It was much more just like a serious documentary.
Yeah.
But it was about a topic that, you know, we need as a culture to have an honest conversation about, you know. So I bring that up because you have Am I Racist doing surprisingly well for a piece of independent conservative Christian media. Like,
yeah.
It's
a good conservative piece of media.
I would say it's Christian in that it comes from the Daily Wire, and sure, not all of them are Christian, but they all have that basic Christian, Judeo-Christian moral framework.
Yeah, and Jeremy Boring, who's the CEO of the company, is a Christian. That is true. Even though they have Ben Shapiro, who's Jewish, and Matt Walsh, who's a Catholic. And I think, isn't Michael Knowles Catholic too? I think he's Catholic too.
Yeah, he's Catholic
and then
as well.
Andrew Klavan is a Christian. So, yeah. We're
so,
big Daily Wire nerds over here, man. Oh, yeah. No, we're just knowledgeable about the folks on the right.
We just spend too much time on the internet.
We just spend too much time on YouTube.
That's really it. We need to go outside and touch grass more.
And listen to some more the liberal voices in the grass. Yep, that's what we need to do.
Oh, man.
Anyway,
if you're hearing liberal voices in the grass, there's something wrong.
There's something wrong with you. You definitely need to get outside more. Those little dews on the grass, that ain't leftist tears, David. That ain't
Oh my goodness.
Gosh. So am I a racist?
Am I racist?
We're considering it because of the moral.
Yeah, because of the moral framework.
Yeah.
That it comes from. I would consider it a conservative Christian movie, even though it's not explicitly pushing like a sort of Christian message. I would say it definitely comes from.
It comes from a good place.
A place of Christian moral values. So anyway, yeah. So, Am I Racist was actually released in theaters.
Yeah.
Which seems like a miracle.
Yeah.
And it actually did quite well.
Yeah.
In fact,
and Jeremy Johns reviewed it even. And he liked it. He thought it was pretty good.
Yeah, it's had a lot of attention from people who normally wouldn't have the slightest interest in that kind of media.
Yeah.
And so, and two, I'm finding, I saw something that apparently the success of Am I Racist is actually driving people to take a look at What is a Woman, because What is a Woman had much more. I mean, it had some cultural relevance for sure, but not.
I would argue it's a very, I don't want to say like political activist film, but I would argue stuff that Candace Owens makes and that Matt Walsh, they kind of walk the fence on that kind of thing. Being a political activist film, being an actual film. And I think Am I Racist is definitely an actual film.
Yeah.
But Am I a Woman is kind of like, okay, let's talk about stuff in the culture, and it's a documentary.
Yeah, What is a Woman is more of a political film.
Yeah.
So it obviously didn't, and it wasn't released in theaters either. No. So it obviously didn't have the same kind of success for the first time around. But according to some article I found, I guess interest in What is a Woman is surging because of the success of Am I Racist? So I see this as, we've still got a long way to go, but stuff like this, it gives me hope.
You know what also gives me hope, David? Is the success of Sound of Freedom in theaters too.
Oh yes, yeah.
Because that was a huge thing to release in theaters. And the fact that it actually made good money and it brought attention to the topic that it was discussing about human trafficking, being that one, just was really a huge bright spot, I think, in the culture. And it happened in the year 2024, this year. And I thought that was pretty awesome. Have you seen Sound of Freedom at all?
I have not.
It's a hard watch, I would say. Like, definitely a hard watch because of the subject matter and stuff like that. But dang, Jim Caviezel, man, is so fantastic in it as the main character, the FBI agent or CIA agent, whatever he plays. And the fact that it's based on a true story, and the fact that it is a good film in general as well. Like, it's a genuinely really good movie. Besides it being here, let's share this message. I would kind of consider that a Christian film too, because everybody I think involved with it were in fact has something to do with a Christian way of life, whether it be the guy who was based off of, whether it be Jim Caviezel, whether it be the director, whether it be 5 and 2 studios or whatever, and Pure Flix who do The Chosen as well.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, it was funded by a Christian company too. So that's just what I would say. But that's a huge, I think, win for or in our culture in a positive way. Mm-hmm. And I also look at The Chosen too. Like, I remember, I think Matt and Heather were going to have us watch it for youth group, and I missed the first week, but I watched the second time we watched it, and I'm like, all right, I know Christian movies, Christian series, it's not all great. So I'm expecting, my bar is really low here. And I remember I was sitting down and watching, I think it was the 3rd episode of The Chosen or something, and I was like, this is not bad. Let's watch another one. And in fact, it was actually pretty good. And I think the whole series, in fact, is pretty decent. Like, it's way better than any CW show out there and any stuff you'll find on ABC, I would say. And the fact that it's taken with such care and it comes off as really authentic as well. And also it takes liberties in the Bible as well, while also telling the truth. Like, liberties with some characters, and a character falls in love with whatever, and this person dies or what have you. The fact that it added stuff like in there, and also like establishes and tells the truth and has everything that Jesus said in there, is really awesome and fascinating. And I think it's a triumph in our culture. But I am worried, I'm worried and also hopeful, because they're trying to build a cinematic universe right now, branching off from The Chosen.
The Chosen cinematic universe.
Correct. So they had a little convention about Pure Flix and stuff like that. And so they're going to have an animated series, and it's going to be a kid's show. So that's one project. And then they're going to have basically a series that's going to explore the book of Acts. So it's going to be a sequel to The Chosen. And then you have, I think they're going to explore Joshua as well. So a bunch of really interesting projects that, who knows if they're going to be any good?
Yeah, but let's hope they're good.
Let's hope they're good. But it makes me worried, because I'm like, only do what you guys can do, guys. Like, just focus on what you can focus on, and don't spread yourself too thin.
The idea of a chosen cinematic universe, it really,
also known as the Bible cinematic universe.
It really screams.
It screams
cringe to me.
It also screams like, "Hey, investors, come invest into us." You know.
Yeah.
But
it also screams like, bursting bubbles.
Well, do you remember the Bible TV series that was on the History Channel,
Do
David?
you remember the Bible?
Well, specifically the one that was on the History Channel.
Yeah,
and it
yeah,
was
I
10
know.
episodes.
Yeah, I remember that.
And they covered the entire Bible, really really squashed the Bible down to 10 episodes. It's like, how the heck can you do that in 10 episodes? And it was, I think, the first foray in the culture taking a notice of, I don't know, the Bible, I guess, in a very notable way. I think this was like 2016, 17, 18, something like that. And specifically, Hollywood's like, whoa, that got a lot of viewers. Let's make more Bible projects. And then Noah was made by what's his name? The guy who did Black Swan. I can't remember his name. But anyway, it was a terrible version of Noah. It was Russell Crowe.
I just love how you were about to say Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, I was about to say Noam Chomsky.
Yes, the famous,
that's not the right name.
The famous action movie director Noam Chomsky.
No, the dude who directed the Black Swan. I don't remember. It doesn't matter.
I don't know his
doesn't
name
matter.
either.
But I remember when the Bible came out on the History Channel. It's on the History Channel too, which is interesting. But I remember seeing it had tens of millions of viewers, and Hollywood took notice, and they're like, "Oh, we need to make more Bible stuff. Steven Spielberg's going to do a Moses movie." And that never happened. It's like I remember that being a very minor win in a very secular world. But The Chosen's actually good. Unlike the Bible show. The Bible show sucked, by the way. It was terrible. Maybe not terrible, but it wasn't any good. But man, The Chosen is also, I think, a bright spot in the culture and a move for a positive force in the culture as well. So, have you watched any Chosen, David?
I've watched a little bit of it. It's not for me.
Yeah,
but
it's not bad.
I recognize that it is engaging people, but
I feel like
not something that I'm interested in.
It's just like, I feel like it's an example of something we're going to see a lot of later, but this is our first step toward that. Like, I would love, this is my pitch, I would love a big ass 3-hour epic of the tale of Joshua. It takes place just the book of Joshua. There's so much you can pull from that, and it would be freaking controversial as heck to make it, because you got the Israelites going in with God's blessing and murdering everybody, and it sounds awesome, and it's awesome. Joshua's great, such a wonderful, awesome.
I love genocide.
But no joke, they murder women and children, whole civilizations in the Bible.
Yeah.
And that would be extremely touchy to touch upon that, not just in today's society, but at all in any time.
Yeah.
But man, would I love to see that in live action and to give me because Joshua was what? I think he was in his 50s, 60s when they went on basically this crusade through Israel. It's I would love to see, hell, give me Tom Cruise, give me Russell Crowe again, give me somebody of that age range and put him in there in this action movie. That would be freaking awesome. Or make it a young Joshua. I don't care. Take liberties with the Bible and do it that way. I don't care. They took liberties with Noah. Noah wasn't 150 or 500 years old when he built the ark in the movie. So make him look 60 years old.
Maybe he was.
But he looked 60.
Exactly.
But that's my dream, is to have a huge, big ass epic movie of Joshua done in the style of Gladiator or something. I think that'd be really dope. But that's one could dream, Yeah.
And
I feel like we're going to see more media in the future like that. And to not just about the Bible, but stuff that comes from that perspective. And I think it'd be awesome. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, there's hope for the future.
There's hope for it,
I think the darkest days are behind us. Hopefully. In terms of Christian media.
Yeah.
I definitely don't want to go back to the Veggie Tales and I kiss dating goodbye days. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that kind of stuff, do you want to save what I wrote up for later, or do you want to dive into Christian media further?
We're
already pretty far there. Maybe
we're getting a little long in the tooth. Maybe we'll do a part 2 of this.
Yeah, part 2. Yeah. Where we'll talk about Christian media and good and bad examples.
Oh yes,
We already have.
Yeah. We'll kind of deep dive a little bit more into the bad.
Yeah. But before we leave, David, I do want to ask a quite, I would say, controversial question. And that question is and this could be just very simple. I'll get to the point. Christian and evangelicalism, Catholicism, they always are related, and usually the stereotype's correct. If you're a Christian and if you're this, this, and this, or one of those three things I mentioned, you're probably a conservative. So why is that? And I mean, I don't know how complicated of a question that is. I'm sure it is, but
I mean,
why are they always associated, and why is the right always associated with Christendom and not liberals? Or
well,
I don't know. Like I've been thinking about it. I just don't have a full answer yet.
Yeah, I think
because I think there's a difference between conservative values and Christian values, but a lot of times they definitely intersect.
Well,
and it can become blurry, I think.
Well, I'll say this.
Okay.
I'll say this, and I think we should do a part 2 of this where we can dive a little bit more into like biblical values versus right and left and that, and also like, the good, bad, and the ugly of Christian media.
Yeah.
I think would be an interesting sort of pairing to do for a part 2 of this. But I'll just kind of like give a little brief overview of the kind of the way I look at it. I would say that conservatism isn't one thing. It's kind of an umbrella term. But like social conservatism has been kind of the norm in many, many cultures around the world for like, as long as humans have existed.
Yeah.
And so,
but we're just talking about the West here.
Yeah, but so I would say that there's certain values have crept into the West in more recent years that are outside of that sort of conservative sort of umbrella, and I would say that they crept in because of the moral decay of the West. And it's more complicated than that, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think that there's a reason why conservative values and Christian values overlap much more easily than Christian values and progressive values. And I think it just has to do with some of the more recent developments, or I should say some of the more out there developments of leftist and progressive ideologies crept into society specifically because of moral decay in the West.
Yeah, I think you're correct in that, because I mean, we haven't really necessarily addressed it right on the podcast, but like the fact that the line of center has been moved substantially in the last 20 years, and the crazy ideas from one side and the other, specifically the left, has crept in and taken over that side and has pushed that middle part over and over and over so far that now I would say it's kind of umbrellaed a lot of more people.
Yeah.
But I feel like it could have, I'm not saying it would or can, but I'm saying it probably can. I say it probably could move back or forth or whatever. But I think it's more like it's changed in this culture today in the West from to basically two camps in my mind. And that is those who are for freedom and those who are against. And usually those who are against have special interests and ways of wanting to control. And those can be found on left, those can be found on the right. And I feel like the people who are for freedom can also be on the left and the right. But as we just saw with this most recent election, people want more freedom, and so they voted for this person. So
Yeah.
I think they voted and they've made their vote heard, you know?
Yeah, I think, this definitely we're seeing sort of a...
and do you feel, sorry, but I need to interrupt you. Do you feel like we have more freedom to talk about discussion because of after this election at all?
I don't know about that. I mean, I was going to talk about this issue regardless.
Yeah. Okay.
But I suppose that Trump's victory in the election probably in like the sense of the wider world, not in us talking about it, but in the wider world talking about it, it probably legitimized the discussing of some of this stuff in the wider world a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think, that stuff was already coming. Like people were already sick, I think, of not being able to discuss certain topics without it getting awkward, So
yeah, I remember hearing Elon talk about, if Kamala wins, then it's going to be a fight between myself, my companies, and the Trades Commission, and they're probably going to try to put all kinds of rules against me and try to put me out of business as much as they can, in which they have been proven to do in the past, especially with the Twitter files and what we've learned from those. But I think it's interesting because with this new sense of victory and the sense of freedom, I think we are going to see a lot more people speak their mind. And I feel like we've always spoken our mind on this podcast. In fact, since we started in was it February of this year? Something like that.
What? Has it been that long?
It has been long. Yeah. So, but I don't know. I was curious about that because I think it has to do a lot with the line shifting with the first question. And with the second question, I feel like you're right. Like there's so many things. I think Sound of Freedom's a great example of that, where people were so tired of not talking about a certain topic or not having it be heard that they just, all right, I'm just going to throw money at this or go support this thing or do this because I want things to change because I'm tired of being held down by the boot of authority, And I feel like that would have happened whether Trump or Kamala won. And I feel like it would have manifested in different ways if Kamala won, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not saying violence in the streets or anything, but I'm saying culturally, the shift was still leaning in that direction.
Yeah. The cultural shift was still happening. And I think what the Trump's victory in the election truly represents is people who have been fighting in the culture war. I think maybe feel like they can breathe a little bit easier now.
Something I've also kind of thought of, and then we can end this episode. Don't worry, I know we've been going a while, but something something I've been thinking about is what is next for this, and what's next for the culture. I mean, I remember seeing a live stream, and I follow, as you know, Melanie Mack and her very outspoken Christian view and her conservative view as well. And I remember seeing her on a live stream, and she was kind of condemning a person who was married and also had an OnlyFans. And so she was like calling her out on a live stream. And it definitely was a thing where it wasn't the right place at the right time. But I saw that like argument and that debate there. And I was like, okay. And this person who has an OnlyFans and was married was also on the right. And it's like, okay, so, or it was a person that would have voted for Trump in my mind. So it's like, okay, well, what kind of talk, what kind of debates, what kind of movement are we going to see culturally? Because I remember, I don't know if you do, but in 2018, 19, and 2020, we were seeing kind of, the right was in power under Trump, right? But we also saw culturally, the right in media was kind of tearing itself apart. I saw Steven Crowder in the Daily Wire is a great example. And they were kind of, even people within the Daily Wire were really having serious debates and being like, no, this is like, no, I disagree with you this and disagree with that. I feel like the in-party squabble is just so a waste of time, but I feel like the ideas need to be put out there. And I feel like the last 4 years have really brought them into focus for a lot of folks on the right to have those debates, but I don't know if everybody's ready for those kind of debates on if I'm a libertarian, liberal person versus, oh, this Christian conservative guy, but we both voted for Trump, what avenue are we going to take this country? You know, what's going to be the next big discussion with that?
Yeah.
Can we get along with all the folks that have come together for under unity, you know?
I think if we could ascribe, I mean, you know, I think there's a lot of ways which you could interpret the election, but let's say you want to interpret the election results as, you know, this country voted for Trump. The majority are now on the MAGA train kind of thing, regardless of whether they're in the center, on the right, on the left, or whatever.
Yeah.
So if that's how you interpret the election, which there's different ways you could look at it,
Yeah.
but if that's kind of my view of it, is that people are like, okay, yeah, Trump represents this movement of people who want to, you know, fix the problems in this nation. So let's get on board and let's do it. I think that's what his victory in the election represents. So with looking at it from that perspective, I think the next step is not necessarily to bring out all the different political issues,
Yeah.
but I think the next step is to focus on fixing what's broken in American society and leave the rest for a later date.
I just am curious of where that date will be, but there's no real answer to that, honestly.
Yeah,
I feel like it'll come in time, honestly. And I don't know what kind of movement that'll be. I don't know who'll be part of it. I'm just curious to see, like, okay, well, are we gonna go back to, you know, the right tearing itself apart while the left kind of swoops in? Are we gonna, you know, see these cultural ideas? You know, is that going to take people away from that movement? Like, what, you know, I was just curious. I'm just something I've been thinking about, honestly, and I don't really have an answer, and I'm sorry to ask you a question that doesn't really have an answer, but I really appreciate your answer and your input. Sorry to put you in that precarious cultural position, David, as David's shaking his hands around. I don't know, shrugging, but I don't know. I just think it's something to keep in mind, because we need to keep on the lookout for when that stuff and that division does happen, because we don't want a repeat of 2019.
No.
You know?
Yeah, I think as far as a societal perspective, and I mean, yeah, as far as a societal perspective goes, I think the nation is ready to start focusing on fixing its problems.
Yeah.
And I think our job as Christians in that is to engage with the culture and not try to bring our specific issues and disagreements with various parties who the various parties that are represented by this, you know, Trump voter coalition into the political arena necessarily. Not to get into it too deeply, but I think one good example of this would be abortion. There was a certain subset of Christians who were gonna sit the election out. I don't know how many of them actually did.
Yeah.
But there was a certain portion of Christians who were talking about they were gonna sit the election out because Trump wasn't strong enough pro-life, because he said he wasn't gonna sign a nationwide abortion ban. And they're like, that's what they were hoping for. Those particular people were hoping that Trump would get in and sign a nationwide abortion ban. But he said he wasn't going to do it. And so these particular group of Christians said, well, if Trump's not as pro-life as we want him to be, can we really vote for him? And I don't know how many of them actually followed through with that or not. I would imagine a lot of the people who said they were going to sit the election out probably still voted for him.
Yeah.
But I bring it up because I don't think now is the time to as evil as abortion is.
Yeah.
I don't think now is the time to bring a nationwide abortion ban. I think now is the time for Christians to engage with the culture and hopefully try to shift culture in a more pro-life direction. I think that's the work that we as followers of Christ can do. And keeping it out of the political realm, I think, is a good thing for now.
Yeah.
And in fact, to be honest, my view is abortion should be more of a states' rights issue anyway, because, I can agree with all the people who said that they were not liking that Trump wasn't going to sign a nationwide abortion ban. Like, I agree with them that abortion is murder. But if you look at murder laws in this country, they're state laws.
That's a good point.
And the reason why murder is illegal in every state is because in our culture, we view murder as wrong.
Yeah.
And the culture of murder being viewed as wrong didn't come from some sort of top-down government ban of murder. We weren't like murderous fools, and then all of a sudden the government's government stepped in, is like, no more murder, guys. It's illegal. And we're like, okay, we're going to stop killing each other now.
Thank you, Andrew Jackson.
It didn't happen that way. The reason why anti-murder laws exist.
Anti-murder laws.
The reason why murder is illegal in every U.S. state
because it's freaking wrong
is because it's wrong, and we as a culture agree that it's wrong.
Yeah.
So I think
what evangelicals, Christian folk need to do is to start that shift, to start like creating culture that promotes that shift. Like, if you have those values, then make culture around it. Like, that's how we've gotten the culture changed before, is by creating culture. And I think like, I agree with you. I think abortion ban is like too much of a thing for everybody to accept, or for everybody to like think of as a good idea. I think it's going to be in one more generation till we get there, but that's my opinion. But I think it will definitely take time. Is my point.
And we may never get to.
And we may never get to it.
A nationwide abortion ban, but at the same time, if culture shifts enough, we may very well get to a place where abortion is illegal in all 50 states.
Yeah, and just a reminder for the audience, I remember a time when. Not to get too political. Oh, we're already in it. Well, I remember when like Hillary Clinton said safe, legal, and rare. And all these politicians who are now on the far leftist side said that. And it's like the middle has shifted, and they're now with their majority of crazy people.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that just because they have crazy ideological makes them bad people. I'm just saying that that's what they believe.
Yeah, and that clearly shows a culture shift.
Yeah.
On the issue of abortion, that it's gone from.
Yeah, I saw folks like I saw somebody, I can't remember who it was, but it was on Timcast, and it's one of the folks they had interchanging during the election like podcast throughout this last week. We're saying like, well, we should make it a federal law. There should be a federal law banning abortion. We shouldn't be having it to the states. It should just be back there. And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? It went back to the states for a reason. Do you want like Roe v. Wade, but you want it to be the opposite? That's not the right way to handle things. We should be a states issue. Like, come on, y'all. So I don't know. It's just I feel like everybody's tuned out of our episode at this point.
Yeah,
Cultured
we've,
and straight up politics.
I think we've gone down the rabbit hole,
Yeah,
so
the
it's
rabbit
probably a good
hole.
idea to end it here.
Yeah,
And
on a
maybe
positive note about
Yeah. And
you go for it. You go.
yeah, I think it's I think we should do a sort of a part 2 where we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of some of this stuff.
I wonder if we can get somebody else on as a third wheel for it. Not third wheel.
That third wheel.
A third chair to join in on it.
Yeah, maybe we'll call up Thad or something.
Yeah, Thad. Yeah, we'll call up maybe Uncle Daddy Thad to come talk about abortion, you know? And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for listening to episode 39 of the Snarp Fangle Podcast. We appreciate your time, your wonderful, very valuable, precious time listening to us. And go ahead and subscribe and like and all that good stuff. Share us with your friends, with your right friends, with your left friends, with all the wonderful friends. And, everybody in your family, we would love them to be Fangles as well. So anyway, have a good day. We'll see you later. And Snarp Fangle on.
Bye-bye now.